Welcome back to the show, week 14, and it's going to be a slightly different week. Not that we're not going to get to the political news. Of course, as always, we will, both political news and just world news from countries around the globe. But there's a couple of little movie news updates that I want to talk about, a little bit of game news, actually, which might stand out because we've never done it before on the show, but it is something that I'm interested in, something I follow every day. And it has a point, I think, and so I will be getting to that as well. We've got some security news. We've got some interesting stuff about the 2016 presidential election. I'm going to be debuting a whole new segment, a religion-focused segment on the show that I'm super excited about, that I'll be doing for probably at least the next month. And, yeah, just a lot of fun stuff. But before we get to our dessert, of course, we have to eat our vegetables. And our vegetables today are security-related. Embassies around the globe stay closed after the alert that was put out by the State Department. They had their travel warning just a couple of days ago, and many of the embassies from countries around the world are going to stay closed, possibly at least until August 10th. Now, all of this is derived from an unspecified Al-Qaeda threat. And there's been a lot of debate going around about this threat and what it means for American security in the future. So I'm going to talk about that. But first I wanted to talk about that I think it's a little bit interesting that so many of the embassies closed down, indicating that they had very little information about where this threat was actually likely to materialize. And now some of the embassies are going to be reopening on Monday, and some of them are going to stay closed until at least next Saturday. Now, the State Department says that they don't have any additional information, and yet some of the embassies will be reopening, which I think is a bit odd. But you're seeing here a list of some of the ones that are staying closed until the 10th, and you're seeing some major cities, obviously Cairo, Riyadh, and Jeddah, several locations in Saudi Arabia. You have North Africa, and actually not so Northern Africa there as well, and of course the Middle East, as you might expect. Now, what's interesting is that some, including Baghdad, Basra, a couple of locations in Iraq, and also a couple of locations in Africa, those are the ones that will be reopening on Monday. And so it doesn't seem to be a regional thing that's causing them to keep these embassies closed. And so, look, we're trying to figure out based on with a little information that we have what's going on, and it's difficult to do so, but that's what we've got. Now, what's interesting about this alert and the travel warning and all of that is that some of the supporters of the controversial NSA data mining, wiretapping, all of the various other invasions of your privacy are saying, look, this is proof that we need these programs, that we have a travel warning like this, despite the fact that there's no evidence whatsoever that the travel warning is being given because of information provided by the controversial programs themselves. They're simply saying, look, we have information. This controversial program gets information, so we should continue them. But that's BS. And by the way, we had these sorts of warnings all throughout the Bush years. Didn't have the programs necessarily, at least during the entirety of that time, thankfully. We were apparently living in comparatively great times for civil liberties, I suppose. But we did have warnings, and that's what I want to transition to now. This warning, I know that they had good reason to believe there was a threat and they have to provide the information because God forbid something happens and American travelers die. They would want to know, why didn't the government know anything? Why didn't they do anything? Why didn't they say anything? And so they're saying something. But this does strike me as a little bit too close to the Bush era. Oh, now we're at orange. Now we're at yellow, back up to red, then down to orange, where they seem to be manipulating us through fear. And I'm not saying that that's what they're doing here, but I think that these sorts of warnings are useless to most people, except where they provide fear, which could possibly help out Obama. He's having kind of a hard time, and they certainly want to get people's minds off of the NSA. So I'm not saying there's a direct link, but it is questionable. And so how should we respond to this travel warning, since it seems like the threat might continue on until at least the 10th, if not later, assuming nothing happens? Look, if I was traveling to one of these locations, and there are many locations on this list, I would of course be worried, and I would very likely cancel my travel plans. But what is the rational way to respond to a threat, even if you knew that it was airplane related, even if you knew which day the attack was going to happen? The only rational response, based on the numbers, is to fly. And the reason for that is that even if you knew that there was going to be some sort of attack, there are so many planes, so many people on planes that the chances of it hurting you are lower than all sorts of other risks that we take every single day. Car accidents, walking on ladders, eating high-fat food, and things like that. The Bureau of Transportation Statistics says that 1.73 million American people fly on any given day, and these numbers are a couple of years old, and so I'm sure that it's even higher now. And so of those 2 million, let's say, people that are flying every single day, even if we knew that a plane was going to go down, that's a couple of hundred people. Out of those 2 million, your chances are almost nil. And I know that this is controversial, but one of the reasons I think you come to this show is that I'm not simply going to say the same things that they have on MSNBC and CNN. Oh my God, terror warning, watch out. No, we have to look at the numbers. We have to be rational. We have to be reasonable. And so I think let's continue on with the rhetoric that we had after 9/11, where we say, we don't want the terrorists to win. So continue to fly, continue to travel, be cautious. If you're going to Jeddah, maybe postpone it for a week or two, but for the most part, I don't think that you have much to worry about. And look, information will continue to roll in about these alerts, about the Al-Qaeda threat throughout the next week, and we will find out if there was actually something planned or if it was just them being overly cautious. But in either case, I think it's interesting, and you should think about your future actions accordingly. Moving on, somewhat related. We're finally finding out something about the future of the U.S. drone strike program, and it's kind of good news, although also kind of laughable. So Secretary of State John Kerry is traveling. He's in Pakistan right now. Now, the reason he's there is partially because Nawaz Sharif was just elected as prime minister, and so they have many things to discuss. Now, he wants to make sure that you know that this is not just a security-related trip. They want to help Pakistan with its recovering economy and things like that. But the most interesting piece of news coming out from the meeting is, of course, the drone strike policy update, I suppose. And I have a feeling that Kerry would not have dropped this quote that I'm going to read for you without planning and without discussing it with Barack Obama ahead of time. So this is what John Kerry said. The program will end as we have eliminated most of the threat and continue to eliminate it. I think the president has a very real timeline, and we hope it's going to be very, very soon. Now, look, for those of us on the left, on the right, who don't like these, what we consider to be illegal drone strikes, we're sick of the signature strikes, we're sick of the double taps. It's not only does it seem to be going against all sorts of different Geneva Conventions and war crimes laws and things like that, but it also seems incredibly immoral, both to strike people when you have no idea who they are, or if they're up to anything illegal, and then especially to kill first responders after they try to help the people that were killed or injured in the first attack. And so we want that to end. But it is interesting that our Secretary of State can go into Pakistan and say, yeah, so these awful things that we're doing in your country when you're a sovereign state, yeah, we plan on ending it soon. That seems a bit questionable. And what I would love to do is, in the next 6 months, anytime any conservative says that America has lost power since Obama became president, ever since now we bow down to other countries, this seems to be pretty good evidence that that is not actually the case. If we can go into a sovereign country and say, yeah, so we've been killing your citizens using drones, we're probably going to keep doing it. But maybe not for that long, so don't freak out or anything. And Pakistan is not exactly a helpless nation. And it's also a pretty strong historic ally of ours, at least for the last few decades. And so, good news, I suppose, coming out of Kerry. I would love to have these drone strikes stop happening, both in Pakistan and also in countries like Yemen and things like that. But it is weird how America can just wield its might without any worry for what other countries might think about what it's doing. Okay, a little bit of local news. Over the weekend, something tragic happened in LA, not far from where we're filming this. At Venice, someone in a car, which has been identified as a dark blue Dodge Avenger, took it upon themselves to go on the Venice boardwalk and intentionally begin running down pedestrians. What you're seeing here is some video that was taken. Now, as always, there are a couple of cell phone videos going around. There's some surveillance video going around. And so you can see a little bit of what happened. There were photographs, of course, released. And it's a very bizarre situation that's going on. And now, obviously the reason that I'm personally covering it is because I live less than 10 minutes away from there. I've been on that boardwalk multiple times. I've brought friends that have been visiting in LA. And it's just horrendous to think about what would drive a person to purposefully try to run down people who are simply walking along a boardwalk. Now, the person that did this is Nathan Campbell. This is a 35-year-old of LA. And they were caught after the hit and run. And unfortunately, while about 10 people were injured, 2 of them with minor injuries, there was 1 death that has been identified as Alice Gruppini. Now, she is an Italian woman. She was a tourist visiting from Italy with her husband. They got married very recently. You're seeing a picture of them right there. The husband is Christian Cassidy. And look, no matter who it was that got killed, it's obviously tragic and horrible. But the idea of these newlyweds walking together while on a trip, and one of them is killed and one of them is horribly injured right nearby and has to see their new wife die is just absolutely horrible. This is what Cassidy said. It's a tragedy. There's nothing more to say. We were walking. We were happy. We were on our honeymoon and everything. And suddenly everything changed. I still can't believe it. And I don't even remember exactly what happened. It's all very confusing. Now, Nathan Campbell, as I said, has been caught after trying to flee the scene, is now being held on $1 million bond. But of course, the most interesting question from here is, what the hell would drive a person to do this? I haven't so far seen any indication of drug use, alcohol abuse, anything like that. Perhaps some sort of psychiatric problems. I would hope. I would really hope that that's what's causing it. And it was not simply, I don't know. It's just tragic. And the fact that it happened so close to where we're filming this is obviously making it strike home a little bit harder. And obviously, you have to continue your life, but this does make you a little bit more scared about visiting places like the Venice boardwalk. Okay. I'm gonna fix this. It's a bit off. Yeah, I went there. I had 2 friends visit from Texas not 4 months ago, maybe. And we went there together. We were walking my dog. I mean, it's constantly full of people. Shops and things like that. I suppose if you wanted to do harm to pedestrians, that's where you go. But let's move on. We've got a very interesting climate-related study. A meta-analysis has been run on over 60 previous studies on climate change that have covered every major region of the world, and it has some amazing findings. Now, this was conducted by researchers at the UC Berkeley and Princeton. As I said, they looked over many dozens of studies that have been done on climate change, and what they found is honestly quite shocking. So, the major finding, the major headline is that drought, flood, and high temperatures strongly correlate with spikes in conflict. And what they're talking about there is both interpersonal conflict, just between people, different violence, and also intergroup conflict, things like civil wars, traditional wars, and these things can be strongly correlated with increasing heat. Now, we're going to get to more of the details, but just straight off, if you weren't worried about global climate change, if you weren't worried about the coastlines being swallowed up, farming being irreparably damaged, and things like that, maybe the extra conflict and violence could clue you in that we need to do something about it. And so, a bit more in depth, their findings. Researchers noted examples including increased domestic violence in India and Australia, assaults and murders in the United States and Tanzania, ethnic violence in Europe and South Asia, land invasions in Brazil, police violence in the Netherlands, and civil conflicts throughout the tropics. And so what they're basically saying there is, at various regions throughout the world, various types of interpersonal conflict and violence can be correlated with increasing global temperatures. And of course, what's interesting is you have to bear in mind that we are actually in the high point of a many centuries-long decrease in overall crime and particularly violence, both interpersonal and intergroup. This is a comparatively quite safe, quite peaceful time, and yet they're finding increased violence in as disparate areas as police violence and domestic violence. Now, what they found is that higher temperatures, out of 27 modern societies studied, all 27 showed a positive relationship between higher temperatures and violence. I don't remember the exact rap song from when I was growing up, but they said that it was something about the temperature being high, and it's a good enough reason to commit violence. Apparently that was grounded in quite ahead of its time's climate science. Now, furthermore, they found that one standard deviation shift towards hotter conditions, and they don't make clear exactly how many degrees that is, causes the likelihood of personal violence to rise 4% and intergroup conflicts to rise 14%. Now, maybe you can wave away 4% for the interpersonal stuff, but 14% higher? Now, I have to assume that that's probably related specifically to droughts, and it causes wars over water and things like that, but Look, that's what we've been predicting for a number of years now is going to happen as climate change continues, as global warming continues. These scarce resources, like water, are going to lead to conflicts at various parts of the world. And finally, and this is perhaps the scariest finding, if the study's calculations are correct, a global temperature rise of just 2 degrees Celsius could increase intergroup conflicts such as civil wars by over 50%. And as Climate Central notes, projections estimate that temperatures will make that jump by 2040. So look, we've got a few years, we've got a couple of decades, but a 50% higher chance of things like civil wars, not to mention the interpersonal crime, the domestic violence, police abuses, and things like that, by 2040. And unfortunately, I don't know that there's anything that we can do by then, because we are so behind what we need to be doing time-wise to get a handle on global climate change. And I'm starting to resign myself, I guess, at this point to thinking that apparently just it getting hotter and things like that is not enough to convince people. But if things like conflict, if things like losing some of your favorite foods, these are various things that we report on this show and on other shows, if that's what it takes to get people to care about global warming, I'll talk about any of the negative impacts. I don't really care. We need to do something now. Now, on to the new stuff. A whole new segment on the show. We're going to call this one The Bible versus Fundamentalists. And what I want to do here is focus on a different area, what the Bible says in this area, and what religious, in this case, Christian fundamentalists say and do in that area. And you'll find that very often there's a big difference between the two. And so for this first inaugural edition of The Bible versus Fundamentalists, we're going to talk about immigration, because the bills are being discussed in the Senate and hopefully at some point in the House. A lot of debate about it. Let's find out, what does the Bible say about immigration? And so we've got a couple of quotes for you. Now the first, this is Leviticus 19:33 through 34, says, "When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." We threw in that last part just to give it that Bible oomph and authenticity. And so that's a subtle message about immigration and how you should treat people who are immigrants into your land, I suppose. Now, we've got others, but I think that that's pretty clear. You should treat him the same as natives. You should love him as yourself. Not just be nice to him, don't kill him, perhaps give him health care. Love him as yourself. And we know that these people love themselves, these fundamentalists. And they reference there, of course, that at one point the group that's being discussed here in this part of Leviticus was a stranger themselves. And this is a direct command from your Lord God. We've got a couple other quotes. This is from Matthew 25:35. "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me." They're, again, making very clear that for strangers, you should make them comfortable, make them feel welcome, the same as you would a member of your own family. And there's some shades there of the golden rule as well, the same as you would want to be treated if you were to emigrate to another country, perhaps. Exodus 22:21 says, "You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." Again, very wise words coming out of the Bible there, referencing the example of this group historically. You should not wrong him or oppress him. And there are certainly some Republican politicians who are Christian fundamentalists, or who think of themselves as very strong Christians, and they want to do them some oppressing of some, let's be real, Hispanic immigrants. They don't seem to have a problem with Norwegians who immigrate or anything like that. But specifically the Hispanics, they gotta go. One more quote for you. Hebrews 13:2 says, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." Now, look, I don't personally believe that if we're particularly nice to Hispanic, Mexican immigrants and things like that, we'll find out that any of them are actually angels in disguise. But perhaps some of them will be future business leaders, future doctors, lawyers, politicians, perhaps. Real-world versions of angels, I suppose, able to help out our country and help us out personally. And so those are the quotes for this first inaugural edition. And I just love that we, like me as a secularist, me as an atheist, I don't have one book that I can look to and say, this is the perfect guide to morality. But the religions, most of them do, especially the monotheistic religions. They say they have the perfect book. And here we've got their Old Testament for them. And it's giving very clear instructions, very clear directions on how you should act in particular areas. And when it comes to immigration, they are very clear. You are supposed to treat these strangers the same way you yourself would want to be treated. Do not oppress them, give them food, give them drink, make them well. I don't think it can be any clearer. Now, obviously, this is not how many fundamentalists in this country feel. They tend to be conservative when it comes to immigration, and that is, of course, driven by intense xenophobia. And unfortunately, where these instructions make clear that you're not supposed to see these group distinctions, you're supposed to see them as humans and love them as such, many of the conservative Christians in America are all too eager to look at things from a tribal perspective, to see it as an outgroup that they don't want, that they feel should be oppressed and discriminated against, and I think it's unfortunate. Hopefully some of them are watching this program and will learn from it, because if they refuse to read the Bible, I will read it to them. Of course, we're going to have more topics on the next edition. Maybe we'll do poverty, maybe we'll do something. But whatever it is, it'll be fun. So I'll see you on the next edition of the Bible versus Fundamentalists. That was fun. Not everything needs to be responding to a direct piece of news. I want to do a public service, and if that's educating some fundamentalists and some biblical literates about how they should act towards our neighbors from the South, I can do that too. Okay, let's move on. Former Republican presidential nominee and all-around douchebag Rick Santorum was on Meet the Press this weekend, and he had an interesting little tidbit that he dropped on all of us. Us politicos are now just responding. This is what he said. I'm open to looking at a presidential race in 2016, but we got a little ways. We got elections in 2014. Now, of course, that was to some degree prompted and all of that, but is anyone really surprised that Rick Santorum wants to run again for the presidency, or at the very least wants to be seen to be running, so that he can get on the major mainstream news shows, so that he can maybe write a book and give his speeches and things like that? I'm personally not surprised. Now, I'm not going to say too much about my own personal opinions about Santorum. It looks like in the near future we're going to have many opportunities for me to display them to you. If he does decide to run, I will, every week if possible, rip him a new one. And so for now, I'm going to just read you some of the most choice tidbits, some of the most offensive comments that Rick Santorum has ever given on a number of different subjects, and I will let him, I suppose, do all of the talking for me. And so, let's start with on the Catholic Church's child abuse scandal. Priests, like all of us, are affected by culture. When the culture is sick, every element in it becomes infected. While it is no excuse for this scandal, it is no surprise that Boston, a seat of academic, political, and cultural liberalism in America, lies at the center of the storm. You idiot, this has been going on for hundreds of years in multiple countries around the globe. There's tons of this going on in Ireland, by the way, which, as far as I know, is not a seat of academic, political, and cultural liberalism. Very Christian, very conservative society in many ways. No problem with Ireland, I'm just using them as a counterpoint. And I love that, yeah, I guess they raped children, but it is Boston after all. And so a lot of empathy coming out of Santorum there. Next, on same-sex marriage and bestiality, the link that he sees there. In every society, the definition of marriage has not ever, to my knowledge, included homosexuality. That's not to pick on homosexuality. It's not, man on child, man on dog, or whatever the case may be. It is one thing. And when you destroy that, you have a dramatic impact on the quality, blah, blah, blah. He goes on about marriage there. And so, again, a lot of empathy coming out there. All this work has been done over the last few years for marriage equality in this country. Screw you guys. It's the same as fucking a dog. I don't really know what to say. This is one of perhaps the best single reasons to never vote for Rick Santorum for anything, including dog catcher, because he seems to think about sex with dogs more than most people. Next, on the link between same-sex marriage and national security. This is an interesting one. I would argue that the future of America hangs in the balance, because the future of the family hangs in the balance. Isn't that the ultimate homeland security, standing up and defending marriage? I think that you've kind of lost us if you can only defend the traditional view of marriage. It's a false one, but it's his traditional view of marriage by implying that it's crucial for national security. We need strong tanks, very well-equipped infantry, and traditional marriage, or else the Canadians will clearly invade. And so I'm glad that he's watching out for us there. Furthermore, this is a historic one on the war in Iraq. As the hobbits are going up Mount Doom, the eye of Mordor is being drawn somewhere else. It's being drawn to Iraq. You know what? I want to keep it on Iraq. I don't want the eye to come back to the United States. Now, look, I'm going to give him a couple of points because that is an awesome, nerdy reference that he's making there. I don't know if he's directly trying to appeal to me from the past, but I love that example, and I will use it for something in the near future, don't you worry. But it's also, again, like, think about how callous and lacking in empathy that statement actually is. Yeah, tons of terrorists are going to Iraq and killing people, and yeah, maybe tens or possibly hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians are being massacred, but I'm safe. Anyway, next, on contraception. This is a controversial one. I love that we're still having a debate over whether or not contraception should be legal in America. He says, many of the Christian faith have said, well, that's okay. Contraception is okay. It's not okay. It's a license to do things in a sexual realm that is counter to how things are supposed to be. I don't know. Generally, if I just read that without the reference to contraception, I'd imagine he's talking about anal sex or something like that. But what does he mean? Like, that generally you're supposed to pull out and this allows you to not do that? Look, he wants to win nationally. National election wants to be the president of the United States, and he thinks it's okay to try to ban contraception. I don't have a quote here on it, but he also thinks that it's a good idea to ban porn in America. I don't know if there are two things that are more popular. Maybe hamburgers. But that's about it. Contraception, porn, these are the things that we rely on to get through our busy days as Americans. Finally, and this one's near and dear to my heart, obviously, on global warming. I believe the Earth gets warmer, and I also believe the Earth gets cooler, and I think history points out that it does that, and that the idea that man, through the production of CO2, which is a trace gas in the atmosphere and the man-made part of that trace gas, is itself a trace gas, is somehow responsible for climate change is, I think, just patently absurd when you consider all the other factors. El Nino, La Niña, sunspots, moisture in the air. Yeah, I don't know if there's actually much to that. Now, I have to imagine that he made these statements after a long, detailed meta-analysis of the data available on global climate change, or perhaps not. He probably just pulled it out of his ass. I don't know if there's warming going on there, but there's obviously not much going on in his head because this is stupid. And one of the reasons I want to cover it is that I love that in future decades, assuming that any of humanity survives the global apocalypse that will be caused by global climate change, we'll be able to look back and say, man, that idiot did not know what he was talking about. Although, to be fair, he's never going to win the presidency, and so it's likely that in 8 to 10 years, no one will remember who the hell he was. And so that is all the Rick Santorum for today. If he does run, we will have more great quotes for you because he's got decades of awesome, offensive things that he's said. And I will make it my personal statement, my personal mission, I guess, to make sure that he never comes within 100 yards of the White House. Now, that is the political news for the day. Let's move on. In just a second, we're going to move on to some media stuff. The next Oscars in 2014 has a host. It's going to be Ellen DeGeneres, a previous host of the Oscars. And so I guess it's what they're always doing. They bring back someone who's hosted before. Now, she did host back in 2007. But wait. Is it possible that there's something else going on behind this? That in fact, they're trying to get people to forget about the extremely offensive, misogynistic 2013 Oscars hosted by Seth MacFarlane? That's probably more likely. And so we're going to talk about all these different angles. Now, let me first off say, I love Ellen. I have no problem with Ellen whatsoever. I think that she is pretty funny. I thought that her sitcom was quite funny. I don't personally watch her show, but I'll occasionally catch a clip because she gets some great guests on. I love the little dancing routine. I'm not a big dancer, but I love how uninhibited she is. And look, she did okay the last time in 2007. 39.9 million viewers, just a little bit shy of the Seth MacFarlane one of 2013. And let's bear in mind it was a number of years ago, and so we have to assume that that would be a little bit higher if it happened last year. Her ratings were okay. They were in the middle of the pack for the last 10 years. And reviews were okay. Obviously, look, you get Ellen DeGeneres to host the Oscars and you're getting a particular sort of thing. It's family friendly, it's not going to offend anyone, it's that sort of thing. Nothing necessarily wrong with it. But of course, there is the flip side of it, that they're probably doing this because of Seth MacFarlane and the negative reaction that he got. Now, the same as when Stephen Colbert hosted the White House press correspondence dinner, I just don't understand the huge amount of opposition that it generated. Like, I understand some of the jokes went overboard, maybe they went a little bit too far, and I can understand that there is some misogyny to what he did. Let's go over some of the more controversial parts. He sang a song about Oscar-nominated actresses entitled "We Saw Your Boobs," which I thought was quite funny. He joked about Chris Brown's battery of Rihanna. He suggested that Quvenzhané Wallis would grow up to have sex with George Clooney. He mocked the Kardashians as being hairy, and he suggested that Jennifer Aniston was once a stripper. I think he was making a joke about Magic Mike there. Now, joking about Chris Brown's battery of Rihanna, I personally think that it needs to be joked about as much as possible because his career needs to be completely destroyed. And unfortunately, that has not happened, and he needs to pay for what he did. Now, doing it at the Oscars, again, maybe that's a bit too personal, a bit too real, but I have no problem whatsoever with the Oscars being sort of a mini roast for the people that are famous enough that they're being nominated and might actually win an award. I think that Hollywood takes itself too seriously, and it loves in the movies joking, and even sometimes doing little meta jokes about Hollywood and about movies and things like that. But it looks like they just can't take it when it happens in person. And look, I think that Seth MacFarlane could have dialed back a bit on some of the jokes, but he's incredibly talented, he's incredibly funny, the ratings were quite good, and I personally think that they should have more controversial hosts. I think that if not for that, it's going to be very boring. Like, you want to see who got Best Director, who got Best Actor, who got, Best Actress and Best Picture. I get that. That's not going to sustain you through over 3 hours. It needs to be funny too. And I hope that Ellen DeGeneres can accomplish the mission of not being too controversial, but also be a little bit edgy, be a little bit funny. That's what I want if I'm going to tune in. So, best of luck to Ellen DeGeneres. Seth MacFarlane, I think you're going to be okay. I'm excited about some of the projects you've got upcoming. I think that TED 2 is going to be awesome. I think that your new science show is going to be absolutely amazing, especially because it involves Neil deGrasse Tyson. I guess you're going to be okay. And Oscars, take a risk every once in a while. Although I guess you did that with Seth MacFarlane at least once. That's something. Now, let's move on to a little bit more movie news. Later on this week, Elysium is going to be released, and I am personally very excited for it, both because I love sci-fi, I love the director Neil Blomkamp, I love District 9, and I think Matt Damon is pretty awesome, and he can't really do any wrong. But there are some people who are a little bit worried about the movie. Not the premise, I suppose, but about the political message that underlies it. And so that's what we're going to talk about here. Now, obviously, if you've seen the trailers, you understand at least a little bit about what's going on in the movie. Matt Damon is from the have-nots that still lay on a absolutely devastated Earth. Orbiting around Earth is Elysium, which is where the haves live, where you can have cancer magically whisked away from your body every single day, where I'm sure the food is quite good. And so there's this huge disparity between Elysium and what's left of Earth. And so obviously there's a huge income inequality element of Elysium. There's also a healthcare element of it. You see in many of the trailers, Matt Damon is injured, and so there's a bit of occupational safety and regulation commentary going on there. And then the actual care that he gets for his injury is basically non-existent. And so that's the healthcare element. And so you've got a lot of, I don't know how hot button political topics they are, but there's certainly things that a certain segment of the population, the more conservative segment, might not like the commentary that Elysium is probably likely to deliver on these various topics. Now, I think that it makes the movie much more interesting. I think that mindless science fiction is about as entertaining as mindless anything. And so I like that there's a message to it. And this is certainly in line with Neil Blomkamp's previous movie, District 9, which was obviously a fairly obvious allegory for apartheid in South Africa. Now, I think that I don't know that the movie is going to be as good as that because the premise isn't quite as strong. There's not the hook, but I like that Charlton Copley, who played the main character in District 9, is in it in a very different role. I think that he was a very unique actor. I'm interested to see what he brings to it. And if they maintain the sort of awesome, kind of low-budget special effects of District 9, I think it's going to be incredibly exciting. But that aside, back to the political message, there are some who are worried about what it could mean if Elysium tanks. Does that mean that directors in the future and the people who fund directors in the future will be less likely to want to invest in movies that have a strong political message? I don't know. It could happen. I think that the movie is likely to do well because we need a science fiction movie like this after a number of failures over the past few months, like After Earth and things like that. Matt Damon's a huge name, and certainly people have been looking for something from this director and from Sharlto Copley after District 9. And I'm not even going to talk about the A-Team. But so I hope that it does well, because I want movies to have a message. And I'm fine with conservatives doing their version of it too. I'm not saying that the message has to be liberal. I feel like the conservative message, if it wasn't subtle in a movie, would be kind of awful, because you can only kick like the have-nots so much. I don't know what audience there would be for that, but I'm going to go see it. I assume that many of you will, and it'll be interesting to see how it's received and how subtle or how overt the political message is, and it might have a lot to say about the future of science fiction movies. Now finally, this topic is going to be a little bit out there. Bear with me, it's somewhat self-indulgent, but I saw the news and I have to respond to it. The next evolution of EverQuest has been announced. It is EverQuest Next and EverQuest Next Landmark, two very related games that are going to continue the EverQuest legacy that has existed through a number of different games over at least the last 15 years. Now, we're going to tell you about some of the details of these new games, and also, let's be real, it's somewhat self-indulgent for me. I'm going to talk a bit about my history playing EverQuest, and also what I think MMORPGs need to succeed and to evolve. Because that's what the hook of EverQuest Next is that this is the evolution of MMOs. And so let's see what it's got. Now, if you've seen the videos, you know that it's continuing with a sort of cartoony style, sort of similar to World of Warcraft games like that. Not very similar, in fact, to EQ1 or EQ2, which had a more realistic, if albeit low graphical fidelity sort of style. And so they are changing in that. Perhaps that you have to, because WoW was such a mammoth, such a juggernaut that's what people expect. Fine, I'm willing to accept that. Some of the big things that this game is going to have, EQ Next, is almost universal destructible terrain and buildings. Now, they say that some things like player cities are probably not going to be able to be destroyed because then it would just be a parking lot. But both the ground, can be affected by spell effects, by the attacks of monsters and things like that. Also, buildings can be knocked down. Other things. Now, what they want is they want you to be able to make a mark on the world, make your mark, I should say, and not just in terms of deforming the terrain a little bit. And so they're going to have these rallying calls where you do things like establish a city, big, large, many player involved, multi-month sort of things that involve many different little components that the devs are going to be involved in. And so that's obviously exciting. Now, this is not the only game that has done that, but they're making it a big part of what they're doing. They're going to be getting away from some of the harsh level, or I should say class restrictions of the previous EQ games, and they're going to introduce multi-classing, which again has been done in some MMORPGs recently, but they're going to be introducing it to EverQuest. And so those are some of the evolutions. Now, as I alluded to in the intro, there's also EQ Next Landmark, which is sort of an exploration and construction, I don't want to say mini game, although I guess it is sort of supplementary to EQ Next, but the obvious comparison is, of course, to Minecraft, or perhaps more recently to Cube World. But what they're going to be doing is they're going to release many of the same sorts of tools that the devs have for producing EQ Next. They're going to release to the public, and that is going to allow you to create almost endless amounts of content for EQ Next players. And so, look, those are some major changes from previous EverQuest games. Now they talk about the movement. It's going to be more parkour-like, and all of that. And what they're saying is that this is what MMOs have needed for a long time, that we can't simply evolve slightly from game to game, from EverQuest to World of Warcraft to the more recent ones that I haven't really played. I dabbled a little bit in Neverwinter. But I wonder if this is what MMOs really need to, I guess, meet the needs of modern players. And I'm not sure that it is. I think that the changes are very exciting. And look, I should say, for the purposes of my own personal history, I played EverQuest for a good number of years. Everyone that I knew played. My father played endlessly. It was a big part of my high school gaming. It was the only game I played for a couple of years, aside from a bit of Warcraft 2, I guess. Maybe Diablo. And so I take it very seriously. I still remember the first time that I journeyed across Norath and died and lost my corpse when traveling from Kanos to Freeport. I still remember the first time when I got to Kunark. I remember exploiting a bug to allow my necromancer to have a whole bunch of pets for one day And oh man, I got so much experience killing giants in the Sea of Solitude, I think it was. And anyway, what I think is the problem is when I think back on EQ1 and my experience there were so many things about the game that at the time I absolutely hated. I hated having to wait 6 or 7 minutes for a mob to respawn. I hated the fact that only a couple of classes could solo. I hated being dependent on other players for things like binding and stuff like that. I hated how the devs didn't seem to want to listen to the players, and they made everything so difficult. And now that I think back on that experience and think about the more recent MMOs that I've tried to play, I wonder if some of those awful things aren't actually what made it an amazing game to begin with. Because I've tried some of the more recent MMOs, like Neverwinter, and there are some huge problems there. Everything is so easy. Everything is offered up on a platter for the players that it can't help but feel meaningless to me. There was no real sense of exploration because there's no sense of danger. If I wander into a high-level zone in Neverwinter, I know that if I die, so what? I'll respawn somewhere. In EverQuest, the original, if you wandered into a dungeon and you died down there, your body had all your stuff on it, you might not be able to get it back. And to get it back, you might have to organize a group to go recover your corpse. And that produced stories, that produced emotions, it made memories about the game that you don't have in modern games. And look, they try in the modern MMOs to make you feel unique and to make you feel important. Every intro tutorial now in the MMOs has you doing something necessary for a conflict. And yet you know as you do it, every other player that's ever played the game has done the exact same thing as you. They try to make it meaningful, but it's not nearly as meaningful as the flawed games that preceded these more recent MMOs. And so, look, I don't know if perhaps no MMO can match the level of emotion that I have invested in games like EQ, and to some extent WoW when it was new. I played before any of the expansions and stuff like that. Maybe it was just a phase that gamers go through, and then eventually other games are fit with your busy schedule, I guess, and your career that you get once you're a little bit older. I don't know what it is, but I do worry for the future of MMOs because I think that the things they talked about here are great, but I think that the desire and the pressure to just do a more modern version of World of Warcraft is going to be very strong, and I think that that's unfortunate. I don't think that that's the future. I don't think that's going to draw in a generation of new players. And because of how much emotion I have invested in the future of EQ, the fact that 15 years later, I still occasionally will check to see, man, they're still releasing expansions to this old-ass game. I want it to be done right. I'm going to be following this as it develops. I'm going to give it a try. So I have my fears, but a little bit of hope as well. Now, that is all the time we have for week 14 of the show. I want to thank you, as always, for joining me. I do this for you guys. I am not chained to any company directly. This is not a TYT program. I'm not chained to any particular ideology. I try to think through everything that I do. And I'm not chained to my wallet since I make basically no money off the program. I do this for you guys. I read all of your comments, even if I don't have time always to reply to them. I love when you guys tweet me about the show. I love when you guys comment about it. And you're the reason that I do this. It takes all Saturday, pretty much every week, but I do it for you guys. And so I want to thank you once again for joining me. And as always, if you have suggestions for things you'd like to see on a future edition of the show, if you have suggestions for a name, perhaps, since I still haven't chosen one, feel free to tweet me at John Iadarola. I look forward to hearing from you guys, and have a good week.